Welcome to the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference. This is Sarah from Cure SMA's Family Support Department. We thank you all so much for joining us for the Navigating the Special Education Process, Transitioning to Middle School, High School, and College session today. We're grateful to our national presenting sponsors, Biogen, Genentech, and Novartis Gene Therapies for their incredible support of this year's Virtual SMA Conference. Please note that the lines will remain muted during the webinar, other than for the speakers. You'll find the chat and conversation tab located on the right side of the screen. You can use this to ask questions throughout the presentation. We would now like to introduce our speakers, Tina Lewis and Kimberly Cook. Kimberly?
Hi, it's nice being with you today. Today's session, we're going to talk about services and accommodations, especially when your child is transitioning into a new environment like middle school, high school, or even college. We'll be discussing transition planning, tools for independence, and disability services that are typically available for students with disabilities. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Tina Lewis. It's lovely to be with each of you today. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, you've heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And if you've been in one of our sessions before at conference or at a summit, this is probably one of the images that Kimberly and I continue to go back to. And it's evolved over time. But this picture resonates with me when I think about my journey with my son, Julian, who is now 17 years old. Equality is all about everyone getting the same resources. So I'm looking at the image on the far left. Everyone, despite their circumstances, is getting the exact same resources. And so it's concerning when you look at the young child in the purple shirt, getting the exact same resource, but not able to access this wonderful baseball game. Equity has been a term that's really come up in the educational field in the past several years. And now you can see that despite the circumstances, each person is getting resources and opportunities that they need with an equal outcome. So now the child in the purple shirt is actually getting the resources that he needs to also be able to see the baseball game like everyone else. And then of course now this image has evolved with adding on liberation, which means now we have eliminated the barriers that have caused inequity. And if there is a picture that captures my own experience in advocating for my son and other children with SMA, this is it. Next slide. This is my son, Julian. I've been doing this session for quite a few years with Kimberly, and I have learned a lot on this journey. And now I said I have to change this image because he's a 17-year-old now. He was diagnosed at the age of 3 at that point in time with type 3 SMA. He walked until he was 8 years old. And unfortunately, after a couple of fractures, he started at the age of 8 using a wheelchair full time. This is his sister, Sienna. When Julian was diagnosed, we were actually expecting our second child. She is a carrier but unaffected, and just a joy. So I'm really going to be just speaking to his journey today in middle and high school, and our earliest journeys in starting to find a college. Next slide. So middle school, there were several things that we did in middle school that really set him up for success. And you know, I will tell you that transition from elementary to middle school was when Julian started to say, enough. I want this person who tends to keep an eye on me to become wallpaper. I want her to pop in as needed. I do not need her there all of the time. So his voice really started to become louder and clearer. It was quite a transition for us in 6th grade, to be honest with you. The school had definitely heard about his needs, and I think in the beginning it was scary for them, because he, you know, as a 6th grader, had very unique needs. Cognitively, he was unaffected. He was affected physically. So he started in a middle school that was actually built in 2015, completely ADA compliant. But I'll share some stories about our own experiences for Julian there. Mr. Streaker was a fantastic principal. It took a little bit of time for him to understand where I was coming from, to understand what Julian needed. He actually attended our last IEP meeting at the elementary school level, which I highly recommend. We did 2 tours to the middle school. The first tour, my husband and I did without Julian. We wanted to get a good feel for what he really needed. And I'm sorry, I have it mixed up. The first tour we did with Julian, and then we came back home and reflected with Julian. And then Derek and I went back to the school and walked the school again, sharing Julian's own insights and what he felt might be challenging, and then again, what we thought might be challenging. Julian had an option. One of the transitions from elementary to middle school is now you have multiple elementary schools coming together in one larger middle school. So navigating the hallways suddenly became an issue. Middle schoolers don't walk in a straight line from one class to another. Julian had the option to leave early, stay late, whatever he preferred. Sometimes he would ask a friend to go with him. It turned out that most of the time he opted to leave earlier. It gave you premium seating at the lunch table in the cafeteria. He was also written into his IEP, provided a copy of the notes, so he never really had to worry about writing. For him is laborious. So he was able to always, no matter how, he would try to take notes, definitely, but if he only got a half page and he's received a full page, it took the stress off of having to take notes quickly. He did have a one-on-one assistant. More so, we put that in place in mid-elementary, and that was for the fear of him falling. We needed to know that there was an extra set of eyes on him. By the time he got into 6th grade, he really wanted that one-on-one assistant to, like I said earlier, become wallpaper and just be in the backdrop. So this desire for independence really came to the surface. Next slide. So, you know, this is his brand new school built in 2015. I think at the point that he started there, it was 2 years old. The information that was shared with me from the start, during the tour, is it is completely ADA compliant, which I was thrilled to hear. But I also had the understanding that ADA compliant has, people have different interpretations of what that means for our children and teenagers. Next slide. So we toured the bathrooms. I highly recommend doing that. And I learned that along the way after my son told me at the end of 3rd grade that he had to take 2 hands and really slam them down on the soap pump to get soap out of the soap dispenser. So we toured the bathrooms. And you can see in this brand new ADA compliant middle school that self-working faucets was fantastic. And then we took a look at the first door that you see there in the middle of the slide. And as I toured the middle school with the assistant principal, I said, you know what, my son is not going to be able to open that door on his own. And his response was, well, can't someone help him? Can't he have a peer or a, you know, his one-on-one assistant help him open that door? And so that did not sit well with me. And I left that session and did some processing and followed up with a conversation with the principal. And I just want to come back to this whole desire to have greater independence. And so I had a wonderful conversation with Mr. Streaker, who really advocated for Julian his entire time there in middle school. And you can see there to the right, he had buttons installed on every male bathroom in the building. So my son never had to rely on another adult or peer to ask him to help him enter the bathroom. So, you know, there's equitable opportunities. We want to advocate for education, but also independence in a building where they spend most of their day. Next slide.
Tina, I want to interrupt you just for a second, because toileting was an issue for Spencer also, but he did not have as much dexterity or strength. So he had to have a paraprofessional actually take him to the bathroom and place him on the toilet. So that was a difficult adjustment in middle school and certainly in high school.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, Kimberly, because another transition that happens in middle school too is that our teenagers are starting to go to gym class now, and there's this huge new setting of the gym locker room, and that created a lot of anxiety for Julian in the beginning. And what they had determined is that he wouldn't need to put on the entire full uniform, but they set up another location in the building where he could go and change. The benches were very narrow, so safety was a concern. But there were many things that we thought outside of, like he had his one-on-one assistants take him to the other room where he would change and prepare for gym class. And sometimes he would just change his shirt and go right back into the locker room. Thank you for sharing that, Kimberly. Just another quick consideration, lockers are another big exciting opportunity about middle school. Some elementary schools have them, but for Julian, this started in middle school. And, you know, I was thinking crowd control, access to his locker. So we had preferential locations for his locker. He was typically on the corner. The school actually had installed a lower shelf because lifting his book prior to treatments was difficult. He actually had his one-on-one assistant meet him at the beginning of the day to help him unload his backpack, and at the end of the day to help him load it. To help him load it. And the lower shelf in the locker really was just one adjustment that helped him to be even more independent. Next slide. So just a few other tidbits of information of things that really worked for him. Like I said, he really did not want someone hovering over him all day. Mr. Streaker, who's a fantastic principal, like I mentioned earlier, had this brilliant outside of the box idea. Julian really needed assistance with writing. Not every student at that point in time had access to a laptop. He was not a fan of using his iPad when everyone else was using paper pencil. So the school actually purchased walkie-talkies from Walmart. He would hit the buzz button on the walkie-talkie, and his assistant would come in. He would share what he wanted written, and she would scribe. And once time was up, or he felt like my ideas are down on paper, she would disappear. That was a small characteristic, or just one example of thinking outside of the box that made a huge difference for him as a sixth grader. And actually that walkie-talkie stayed with him through 8th grade. Ensure safety plans are intact for any elevator failure, emergency drills. We are in every educational setting now unfortunately thinking beyond the fire drill. So there needs to be a different plan for every drill that the school puts in place. Consistent communication and advocacy, avoid assuming anything. I loved the principal at this school dearly, and I made one assumption one year about a field trip, and the assumption I made left my son in a predicament during the field trip. So I can't say enough. Our educators, and I'm an educator myself, they're busy. They're trying to do everything they can to set every child up for success, and sometimes just things fall through the cracks. So stay on top of any plans that you need that will set your children up for success. Another really key component of his success in middle school was definitely the choice for physical education. So he had to take PE, despite my own wishes. That is one of the aspects or subject areas that I really wish we could have avoided, but they made it fun for him. So he had the choice to go in and participate in PE class, or he could go and do some exercises, do some stretching with an adaptive PE teacher. If he decided to stay in, that adaptive PE teacher would always stay in with him, and he and the adaptive PE teacher would always talk about, like, okay, how can Julian be a part of what's happening? How can they modify what's happening so that Julian can engage with peers? I would say most of the time he stayed in. I think there was, when they were doing a unit on volleyball, he wanted to be out. Opportunities to get out of his chair. So at this point in middle school, he is using, or was using, a chair full time, and he did have the opportunity during a flex period, which just is free time, to actually transfer and get out of his chair, or be with the adaptive PE teacher and get out of his chair and do some stretching. PT at that point was by consultation only, and that was really out of a desire for Julian to spend more time in class. Next slide. One of the things that really started to become essential, although always essential, was that in middle school there are more opportunities to become involved. Our kids get really excited about clubs, and our teenagers start doing things outside of school. And he was nominated to be a part of a leadership summit. He was in multiple clubs. He became a tour guide for the elementary students coming over to the school. He was part of a science club, team sports. It really gave him the opportunity to be social, and I think the school really maximized and welcomed him and ensured that there were opportunities he could participate in. You can see in that top picture there, that's him, and he liked going to drama performances, and the director of drama always ensured that he had a prime spot to, which we know is an issue just in the public. He had an opportunity to make sure that he could see special programs at the school as well. And then the bottom image, you can see that he's there in a competition at school. So he really engaged socially with peers. Next slide. So I included these images. You can see my son's principal is actually in the right image there, leaning down, and I can't say enough about him as a leader and how welcoming he was for Julian. So this is the 8th grade farewell, and my biggest concern, and it's hard to see, and I wish I had it in a picture, but you can see the stage there to the left in the left photograph, and there's two ways to get to the stage and be on the stage to receive your certificate of 8th grade completion. And so I thought, oh no. What I did prior to the 8th grade ceremony is I just sent an email and said, as you are planning the procedures for the ceremony, please take Julian into consideration. I would like for him to be included as much as possible with peers. And so my vision, I didn't know what they had in place, but I knew I had advocated for a successful ceremony, and in lieu of having all of the other 8th graders walking up the steps and Julian going around to the back of the stage and going up the ramp, they had all 220 8th graders walk around the back of the stage, up the ramp, and cross the stage in the same way that Julian did. And for me, it meant a ton, and I know for Julian, it there's no comparison. So, but again, it was just out of an email. As you're planning, please take my son into consideration. Next slide. So, after we finished 8th grade there, and that left me and his principal in tears, always be a special man in my heart. I asked him, I said, what kinds of things? So, we're working with other families who have children and teenagers with SMA. What kinds of things would you say to the principals and to the other educators who work with teenagers with SMA? What would you say? What was difficult? What was easy? And the principal said, the most important thing is finding that balance between providing an opportunity to be independent and keeping your child safe. And I just found that to be very interesting. And this is actually an image of us on holiday, and you can see my son there. This is in Central Park, all the way down in the middle of that bike lane there. And that's what he wanted. And this principal found that balance. Next slide. So another thing that his adaptive PE teacher shared with me is that it was essential to plan ahead, like to think outside of the box in the middle of PE. What is going to be happening in PE, and how can I make sure that Julian is a part of what's happening in PE, that he learns, and that he's also with his peers. And just planning ahead for field trips, planning ahead for emergency drills. And on my end, making no assumptions that those plans are in place. Next slide. So soon we started the transition to high school, and we had every intention of going to our public high school. So after that fantastic experience in middle school, our plan was that my son would be going to the public high school. I did a tour, which I highly recommend, in the December prior to his freshman year. And honestly, if I could have gotten it even earlier, I probably would have, but that first quarter of high school is just very busy for educators. So I did a tour on my own with the principal, and I will tell you, I left with a laundry list of modifications that needed to be done to this school. It was built in the 50s, and there were ramps the height of mountains in that school. In fact, when Julian did his own tour of the school, that was the one thing that really stood out to him, was the height of that one big ramp that got him to the second level. So after that tour, and after a lot of conversation with Julian, we opted to consider a private school. And so he had gone through the application process, and this private school is on a campus, so that was also very overwhelming to me as far as weather is concerned. But he has been there going into his 4th year, and it's been fantastic. And he's much more independent than he was even in middle school. So when you go on that tour, visit while school is in session. It's really critical. I learned a lot by going on the tour while school was in session, even seeing the classes that they had planned for Julian to take. Follow multiple paths of travel and get a sense of what the high school schedule might look like. So we really wanted to be active in, okay, how can we conserve energy for our son, and thinking about how they're going to get from point A to point B, and how far point A is from point B, and how fatiguing that could be is something really critical to consider. And high schools do have some flexibility with that schedule. Next slide. So this is the high school where I had the laundry list of changes that needed to be made, and it was critical in Julian making that decision for private school, as well as my husband and I. Next slide. So currently right now he is navigating this campus. We realize as he prepares for college to access an even larger campus, we're considering the need for a different chair, but he has had a wonderful, wonderful, great experience at this school. And just to highlight one of the things that they did, next slide. Our concern about Julian going to this private school was accessing the private school from a 45-minute distance. And so my husband and I both start work prior to his school day. And this school, it never hurts to ask, they actually purchased a fully accessible shuttle, which picks him up 10 minutes from our home and actually takes him into school each day. And while I'm thrilled for Julian, I am even more thrilled to know that once we leave after the end of next year, his senior year, that any child who needs an accessible way to travel on field trips to get to school, Julian has helped to pave that way for those teens.
So Tina, was it your idea? Was it your family's idea to go to private school, or the public school's idea to go to private school?
Oh, great question. It was our, Julian really wanted to go to public school to be with his friends that he had grown up with since preschool. Honestly, I think the turning point for him was two things. One being the inaccessibility of the high school that he was going to attend. I think that that ramp, in addition to, a periodically dysfunctioning lift, was nerve-wracking for him as an 8th grader. And the scholarship opportunity that he received at the private school also helped to just make it an easy decision for him.
Okay.
So yeah, that it was our decision. Great question. Next slide. So just something that I really learned between the difference, one of the things that I learned very quickly from middle school to high school is that Julian started to take AP courses in high school, and you really, basically with a documented disability, our children, our teens can qualify for accommodations. And I've just mentioned a few here: assistive technology, extended time, extra breaks, approval for using a computer to type the essay, a writer, a scribe. Julian actually qualified for extended time and a writer, scribe. The biggest mistake that I learned on my end is that when he started his freshman year, he needed to apply for those accommodations by that October. And so he only had the opportunity to take the practice AP exam that first year as a freshman, which was fine. Everything was in place by the following year. The deadline did creep up on us, and we really had no idea as parents. And so it's one thing that I wish we could go back and change, but it all worked out. But just know that prior to that freshman year, you want to talk to the case manager and make sure you know when that deadline is to apply for those accommodations. Next slide. And like I said, requesting those accommodations is a requirement. I will say that it's been, Julian has received accommodations on all AP exams. He receives accommodations, honestly, of extra time and scribe on any exam he takes in school on a day-to-day basis. And he also just received those accommodations through the College Board for SATs. This year's date was January 15th, and I'm just wondering if they made it a little bit later because of the pandemic. Next slide. So we are in the midst of searching for colleges. It's an interesting experience coming out of a year of a pandemic. We've done many tours. If there's one beautiful thing that's come out of it, several colleges are offering the opportunity to tour their campuses virtually. So we have probably looked at more colleges than we ever would have had it not been for the pandemic. And now we've almost eliminated, these are the ones that we definitely want to go to because the campus is appealing for Julian on multiple levels. And I just shared with Kimberly, I highly recommend doing this. Julian used to play wheelchair basketball, and one of his former athletes who he became friends with uses a wheelchair, not full time, but most of the time, and attends University of Arizona. And it really changed his perspective on how important it is to ensure that a campus is fully accessible. And so it was just really helpful. It's wonderful to go to the virtual tours, but it's also really powerful to hear the perspective of someone who uses a wheelchair to navigate a campus. So to be continued. It's very exciting, and I'm very excited for him and a little nervous for me, but it'll be great. Next slide.
Yeah, what I'm going to talk about is Spencer's experience in high school, and mostly talk about college and that transition to college, because there's a lot to that, especially emotionally for a mom. But transition planning is a process for students who receive services under an IEP to help them decide what they want to do after high school. Do they need training in a specific skill? Do they want to go to college? Are they trying to live independently? I mean, it doesn't have to be career oriented, but it can also be personally oriented. But the transition planning helps a student figure out how to meet their goals. So what the whole purpose of this document is to help the child live independently, become a young adult. The school is required to make this document part of the IEP when the child turns 16. In Texas, where I live, typically we started at 14. It really depends on the school, because you really want to gear their classes way ahead of time to help them reach their goal if they want to go to college and take those prerequisite classes when they're in middle school. But the team that works on this transition plan includes the student. It can include the parents. It includes teachers, the counselors, the caseworkers, but the whole goal is to identify the student's strengths and interests to help them, guide their pathway. It has two important pieces. One, it has post-secondary goals. What is the student going to do when they leave high school? And then transition services. So these are services that happen in the public school and are the responsibility of the public school under the IEP. And they can include instructional activities like planning their course load in the direction of college if that's where they're going. Any related services, like do they need assistive technology to help them become more independent? Do they need voice to text software to help them become independent? So everything is geared toward independence. It also can include community experiences, like any kind of volunteer work they might do in the area that they have interest in. It also will include career and college counseling, and then even help with daily living skills. Will they need to do their own laundry when they go to college? Will they need help picking things up? I mean, any kind of daily living skills will be part of this transition planning. So it's a key component of the IEP when the child turns 16. Next slide. This is Spencer. He has aged since I've been doing this presentation, so this is a new photograph. But he was diagnosed at 11 months with type 1. Now we know that he has type 2. He's 34 years old now, so we didn't have as much genetic testing, or we didn't have any at that time. But I'm going to talk to you about what we did right and what we did wrong in preparing him for college. And my hope is that you do more things right than we did. Next slide. When Spencer went to high school, he had been in elementary school and middle school in a small rural school where everything was handled I mean, there was really not much transition for him going into middle school because it was on the same campus. The same people were working with him and that kind of thing. But when we went to high school, it was a little more difficult. It's just like Tina was saying, there were a lot of things that need to be adapted at the high school for a student in a wheelchair. And it was not an easy thing to get those changes made. I think they added one door opener per semester. I mean, they were trying to allocate their funds, but Spencer really was not given the independence that I felt like he needed. He did receive physical therapy, and we were gearing toward college at this time, so we're looking to increase his stamina. And it was also getting new people trained to transfer him for toileting, and that was important. He'd had the same person, K through 8th grade, and then to train a new person, it was a good step toward college too, because he was going to have to train a new person when he went to college, but he had our support there, so it was a good balance. His occupational therapist was very, very important because he was working on using assistive technology that would help him with independence. He used voice recognition software, and Tina was talking about the books earlier in the locker. Spencer doesn't have the strength to lift a book, so they left a copy of each textbook in each classroom. So the book was so he did not have to move the books from place to place. He always had a paraprofessional to assist him, and he too used a walkie-talkie. And that was very simple because it eliminated that one-on-one hovering kind of thing, because Spencer was very independent as well. He didn't want people to know that he needed help. And I guess for the school too, it made that person a little more versatile in helping with other things throughout the school. But his primary directive was Spencer in taking care of the things he needed. He also had a service dog, which was helpful in high school, and that dog also went to college with him, which was, I think, more for my benefit than for his, because it made me feel a little safer knowing that he had a dog that would help him and protect him if needed. And we also had adapted bus for wheelchair access, so he left our neighborhood and went to the high school. Next slide. Okay, we did have some barriers in high school. One was the accessible door to enter and exit the building. And thinking back on this, when I was doing this presentation, it made me realize that these barriers helped us prepare for college, because we knew to look for these things prior to going there. And it's very interesting, when Spencer went to college, the building he was supposed to access did not have a door opener. So we'd ask about that prior to him starting school, and it was installed, and they had no problem with that. They also did not have a plan in case the elevator broke down. I thought I had planned ahead, like Tina said, don't assume that they're going to do what they say they're going to do, because my plan was, and they agreed to it, was that if the elevator broke down, they would take the class downstairs to the library, hold class downstairs so Spencer wouldn't miss it. And he was taking accelerated classes trying to get into college, so he really couldn't afford to miss class. Well, he missed class over and over and over again because the elevator broke down. So that was something we addressed when he went to college too, and they were a little more, they agreed, yes, we'll move the class if Spencer can't get to it. So that was a good heads up for him. And another one that was really, really tough for me is the administration at the high school wanted Spencer in a self-contained classroom with kids with other disabilities. And I had to become the special education mom nobody wants to be in order to get him into regular classes. I mean, that would have been a nightmare and totally out of his transition plan that we'd started in 8th grade.
Can I add something in, Kimberly? And that's when we toured the initial high school that Julian was going to attend, because of a schedule conflict, he was going to have to be in a self-contained classroom for gym class.
Oh.
And I can tell you just it was not the appropriate setting for him whatsoever, and really would have been harmful to, I think, his what he was able to do, and his confidence level. It just, so that's why I think when you do the tours, it's great to do them when no one is in the building, so you get one perspective, but it's always really wonderful to do the tours when school is in session as well.
Yes. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, here it comes. Okay, I want to talk a minute about special education versus 504, because I'm assuming if you're here watching this session, your child's already been in special education or 504 K through 7th grade. But special education is a free, appropriate public education that's available to children with disabilities. And it ensures special ed for kids and related services to those children. But as soon as the child graduates from high school, those services disappear. So that it's not something that follows you to college or even into trade school. I mean, as soon as the child graduates, those services are no longer there for your child. On the other hand, 504 is a law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. So it ensures that a person with a disability is given equal access to an education. So when your child goes to college, they will be covered under 504, just because everyone is. I mean, it's just part of the general population. But what is important here also is that there's no longer any paperwork, special education paperwork or 504 paperwork. I talked to the university here where I work, and he said the disability services dean told me that if he can see a child has a disability, he does not require paperwork. If it's obvious, I mean, he doesn't need it written down. So I don't know, I would doubt most schools are like that, and that they typically require special education paperwork or 504 in order to get disability services when they go to college. So those are some things to think about. Next page.
So Kimberly, can I ask you a question? That would be something, when I reach out to a college, that would be something that I should ask. Like how can we provide documentation knowing that Julian would continue and shift from an IEP to a 504? What documentation do you need at this Disability Resource Center to provide a 504?
Right, and they're not going to call it a 504 because it's not a document anymore. It's just a general law that applies to the university. So they'll be protected under 504, but it's no longer called, I mean, like in public school, we call it a 504, but just remember, it's just a general law that protects our kids. And then this is the one thing I really want to stress. After high school graduation, the student is responsible for his accommodations, not the school personnel. So typically when our kids are in public school, the adults in the room are responsible to make sure your child gets the notes from the lecture. They're required to make sure he gets extended time on a test. But in college, that is not the case. And when I talked to the university, the disability specialist said it's like the health clinic. If your child needs services from the health clinic, your child has to tell health services they're sick. And the same way with disability services, if your child needs assistance or needs extended time on a test, he needs to tell disability services. So it's the student's responsibility. And I think about when I teach at the university, I get a document from disability services telling me I have a student in my class with a disability, and these are the accommodations that student is allowed. So that's all I have to do is hold that piece of paper. When I give a test, the student has to come to me and say, I need extended time on my test. And then I set that up with disability services. But it's not my responsibility to be sure they get extended time. Next slide. Okay, there are some resources I want to point out to you. One is the National Center for College Students with Disabilities, and this just has a lot of good resources on a federal level. On the other hand, each state has vocational rehabilitation services. In Texas, we call it the Texas Workforce Commission. But this is a very important resource. And they will help counsel your student and guide them into getting the education they need to fulfill their goals. And oftentimes that person, I would highly recommend that counselor from the vocational rehab goes to your last IEP meeting to make sure those transition services, he knows what the transition services were and can follow through post-graduation. And they will pay for things that will surprise you. Well, it surprised me. They paid for Spencer's tuition to go to college, and they also paid for attendant care. And they paid for his books, which allowed us to be flexible in how we could help him financially as well. So don't forget to look into vocational rehab services in your state. Next slide. Okay, when you're considering colleges and universities, I don't know if everybody does this, but I did. I called the dean of the actual school. Spencer wanted to be an architecture major. So I called the deans of the universities he was interested in. I spoke to the deans at Texas Tech, the University of Texas at Austin, Rice University, and the University of Texas, San Antonio. And we all know the universities have to follow the law. They can't, they have to be accessible. They can't discriminate against a student with disabilities. But it was important to me to know the heart of the university, where the people that were going to be involved with my son, how did they personally feel about disability? And I was pretty surprised. Texas Tech was so flexible and so gracious. I would have sent Spencer there in a heartbeat. But in Texas, where I live in Corpus Christi, it's an 8-hour drive. So you have to take that into consideration too. How hard will it be to get your student home and back to school again? So Spencer wasn't driving then, so that meant I would have to drive 8 hours to pick him up and drive home. So, but they were just very accommodating, very flexible, and I just felt Spencer could have been very happy there. The University of Texas at Austin, where Spencer ended up going, they were open. They were open to being flexible. It was like they hadn't had a student like Spencer before, and they just wanted to ask questions, which I thought was good. I mean, I felt like we could work with them. Rice University, and this was quite some time ago, so maybe it's changed, but they were so inflexible, there was no going there. I mean, he was going to have to do every single assignment like everybody else did, and they were extremely rigid, so I knew that was not a possibility. And I can't remember UT San Antonio, but I don't think that was one of Spencer's top choices. So I would recommend calling. And even, I'm not sure why I called. I guess I was being a controlling mother, but your student can call also. I mean, you just want to get a feeling for where you're going, the vibe of the campus and the adults in the room.
Can I add something on, Kimberly? So I spoke earlier about the beauty of being able to visit colleges virtually right now, and you're able to ask questions in the chat box. And I have watched many of these with my son, and I can tell you that when you ask a question about accessibility, the responses from the colleges are eye-opening. And a huge factor in considering which college would be ideal for your child. But it's I highly recommend visiting and attending some of these virtual sessions, and their responses are interesting.
Yeah, sure. We learn a lot, right? Okay, next slide. Okay, every campus will have a disability services location or office. It might not be called that. It's just called Disability Services at Texas A&M and Corpus Christi. At UT, it's called Services for Students with Disabilities. And you can see in the drop-down box of my picture there that it tells you how to register with the disability services, what kind of accommodations and services they offer. They give you information about housing, accommodation, placement exams. I mean, you should be able to find a lot out by going to the disability services page of the universities you're interested in. But I would also call them and ask questions about assistive technology specialists. Do they have a knowledgeable person that can truly help your child with whatever assistive technology they need? What kind of assistive technology is available? Do they have screen readers? Do they have software? I know at our university, they have lots of software online that students can access. And also talk about the options for accessible housing. I know even at UT, all the buildings had some accessible dorm rooms or apartments, but some were more accessible than others. So you want to look into campus clubs and activities and the accessibility there too also. But this is a very important place to go at any university that you're looking at attending.
And so sorry, Kimberly, I just wanted to add one thing. So I talked about the benefit of speaking to a dear friend of Julian's who is now on campus using a wheelchair most of the time. And she said that her first year, the laundry room was not accessible. And so she's fairly independent, but doing her own laundry, her dorm room was accessible, but actually being able to go in and do her laundry was not. So it's something that honestly, as a mom on this journey right now, new with my son, it's something I would have never thought about asking. So it's about the accessibility of everything.
Yeah, and you reminded me, Spencer, well, I hadn't planned on including, but Spencer took a service dog to college. So where was that dog going to use the bathroom? I mean, that was a big deal because Spencer couldn't pick it up, you know. So they ended up putting a sign out that said this area is for service dogs, but it took a while to sort of figure that out, and it wasn't something I planned in advance. Next slide. Okay, there's a lot of assistive technology available through the universities. Digital books, and I'm going to provide the Bookshare link at the end of our session, but Bookshare is a great place to get all your textbooks, high school, middle school, and at the university level, and they're free. And your disability services can help you access those as well. Text readers, copies of notes, they'll help, they can give or loan out recording devices for lectures, and then extended time on assignments and tests. Typically, disability services will have the student go to a specific place to take the test. Even it can be during the class or before and after, however you schedule it. But it's typically, remember, it's not the professor's responsibility to give extended time. So they typically go to another location. Adapted desks. And then Spencer, he was in architecture, and for 2 years, students do their drawings by hand. And Spencer couldn't do those just because of his limited strength. So UT allowed him to use AutoCAD as a freshman, which the students traditionally don't use until they're juniors. And then to back up a little bit, in Spencer's transition plan in high school, he said he wanted to be an architect. And so he learned AutoCAD in high school in preparation for college. So, I mean, that all really flowed and worked together really well. But when you go to the Disability Services Office, just like in high school, everything will be individualized and be geared for your student. And your child needs to speak up and let the people know what supports they need. And always remember that it's the student's responsibility to ask for the accommodations. They're going to have to go to the office and say, I need help writing, or I need special software. And that the professor will get a notice that your student gets accommodations and will abide by those. Next slide. Okay, this brings back memories. So when I cannot tell you how hard it is to leave your child at college. I was nauseous. I thought I was going to throw up. I was sick leaving him on campus. It's very, very difficult, you all, because our children are vulnerable. You're leaving them with strangers. University of Texas is such a big, big place. But look at his little smile. The picture's fuzzy, but you can tell that's exactly where he needed to be at that time. As I said before, the service dog was for me, made me feel a lot better. But Kenai was he was a good social icebreaker. He helped Spencer meet a lot of people. Anyway, it's hard. But I'll share some things next of what made things better and what made things I should have done better. Next slide. Okay, things that we did ahead of time and confirmed. It was very difficult to find attendant care. Spencer needs total assistance with personal care, showering, toileting, everything. I looked and looked. I put messages on bulletin boards in churches in Austin. I went to campus and put job postings on their websites, and I could not find anybody. I ended up finding, we went for a campus tour, and I asked the young student giving the tour if he knew of anybody, and he said he would be interested. I was like, wow. But he was not very interested. He was like, I'll help you, but he really didn't want to. And what ended up happening, and at the time we felt like we needed to do this, is we paid for the caregiver's room and board in order to have him assist Spencer. He was still making a wage, an hourly wage through Texas workforce, but it made it work. It was not the best situation, honestly, and I think it was real difficult on Spencer, but we all learned a lot, and he is where he is now because of it, which is in a good place. We also had to look at accessible housing, showers, and then ask about the different accessible rooms, because usually they're in the corner of the building and are usually larger, and you do want a larger space for equipment and wheelchairs and that kind of thing. Look at the classroom buildings, ramps, door openers, access to classrooms, dean's offices, that kind of thing. And then academic accommodations. They had a studio where the architecture students worked and worked on their assignments with big drafting tables. So they gave Spencer a lower table and a laptop for his AutoCAD software. And one big thing that they let him do is in architecture, you have to build models of your buildings. And Spencer couldn't do that. So they let him hire other students to make them for him. He came home once and I tried to do it for him, and it was so hard because he would have to, I think it was harder for him to voice what to do and articulate the dimensions and how to cut things. So it was hard on him, but I thought that was a really nice accommodation to allow him to let other people build his models. And then he had the service dog. Next slide. Okay, there's a couple things we should have thought of and didn't. It is key that you find a team of wheelchair repair people, especially if your child has a power wheelchair, before you go. So this wasn't a funny story at the time, but it's funny now. But Spencer was at night driving across the street in the pouring down rain, and he called us. We were literally in a parade at night in Corpus Christi. He's stuck in an intersection in Austin in his wheelchair and couldn't move. I mean, talk about scaring the life out of you. He ended up getting some friends to push him into a building until it stopped raining. They pushed him to his dorm room, which scared me because it was on a steep hill. And I'm like, do they realize how heavy that chair is? It all worked out fine, but it took a long time to get that chair repaired because we did not have a team in place. And I don't know what we were thinking in not doing that, but that is pretty critical. So he had to stay in his room. It was almost like a week where he could not leave unless somebody pushed his power chair for him. So that is critical. Another piece is the medical team. We had our medical team in Corpus Christi, so we're 3.5 hours from Austin. And I thought if he ever gets sick, he'll just come home. Well, he got pneumonia and was in ICU before we even got a phone call. So I felt it was very critical. It worked out fine. The people that treated Spencer were wonderful, and they are still his medical team today, 10 years later. But at the time, it scared me because I didn't know who they were. So I think Spencer's treated fine, and he was good and had good care. But I think I would have felt better as a mom if I had known who these people were, you know, before we went to Austin ourselves. Next slide. So I've shared the difficulties of sending your child off to college and how hard it was for me as a mom. But you all, it is so rewarding to see how he is today. And he was honored at UT for his tenacity in getting his education in the face of hardship. He wanted to know, he's not a football fan. He wanted to know if he had to go to the game. But we said, yes, you have to get your award. So that was cool. And you can see how much they embraced him as a student at the university through that picture. Next slide. And I also feel how worth it was, because look at this community that he has. This is at his house, having dinner with friends. A lot of these people are students that he went to school with that stayed in Austin. But I really don't feel he would have found that community, or he wouldn't have if he'd stayed home, you know, with us. So it's just beautiful to see him in an environment like this. Next slide. It also made him very independent as far as his driving. I've always told him I would help him I've always told him, just ask me, I'll do whatever you need me to do to help you with attendant care, with like medical equipment, but you have to ask because I don't want to assume he can't do it himself. But I did tell him I wouldn't help him get a car because it scared me. So he took care of all that, and now I realize he's safer driving than he was cruising the sidewalks of Austin in his chair. So it was good. Next slide. And the best thing is he found a fiance, and they are soon to get married. I'm going to a bridal fair with her on Saturday. I'm very excited about that. I just want, as difficult as it was to send him to school, I think the beauty of his life makes it worthwhile. Next slide. And this is the book share that I wanted to share with you. If you just do a Google search, you can find Bookshare, but even students, middle school, elementary school, it has newspapers, but this is a free resource for people with disabilities. So it just makes life a lot easier to have digital books. Next slide. Anything else, Tina? Anything you want to add?
I think college is a very, very exciting time, and I live on the East Coast in Maryland, and my son would like to go as far away as possible. He wants warm and flat, so the goal is USC and California. So, Kimberly,
Or Texas. Come to Texas.
Kimberly is also in Texas. So I'm hoping for the East Coast, but it just shows you, I think, just in hearing Spencer's story, and there's nothing that they feel they can't do. And my son is a 17-year-old boy who just can't wait to leave home. So
Yeah, and I think another thing about sending Spencer to school, we didn't know if he would call us in a week and say, I can't do this, or a month and say, this is too hard. So we were always prepared to take him back home. That never happened. He was pretty resilient, but I just think the flexibility is important as far as sending our kids, that we're there for them, but it's like your principal said, it's that balance between independence and safety.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tina and Kim, for such a great and informative presentation today. We really appreciate your time with us. And I did want to make sure everyone sees we have a closing session tomorrow evening. We want to make sure that everyone joins us. It's going to be lots of fun, and make sure to wear your conference t-shirt or your Cure SMA gear if you have that as well. So just be sure to join us. That's Friday, June 11th at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. And then we just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who joined in today. You will see a survey linked in the agenda information, and you'll also be receiving a follow-up email with this survey link as well. And we'd welcome any feedback that you have to share. And once again, we're incredibly thankful for the support from our sponsors for making the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference possible. Also, don't forget to join the virtual exhibit hall this afternoon from 3 to 5 p.m. Central Time to visit and see all the services and products that the companies have to share. You'll also be entered to win one of our daily exhibit hall prizes with each booth you visit, and winners are going to be announced at the closing session tomorrow evening. If there's anything that we can do for you, or if you have any additional questions, please email us at familysupport@curesma.org. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you again for joining us for the 2021 Virtual SMA Conference.